Hello, good morning, guys. Welcome to the live analysis session of Symbiosis Entrance Test 2026. First of all, thank you so much to all the students and the mentors on the ground who've reached out to us. Okay, it has helped us a lot in preparing a very good analysis. Okay, we are starting the session a little early because we kind of got everything that we needed beforehand. Okay, so now SET 2026 was conducted on time. It was reported at multiple centers that the test started exactly 9 a.m. So that was one very good thing. And in today's discussion, we'll talk about the pattern, the test interface, what was the sectional breakup, and we'll also discuss the strategy that people should apply in the round two, right? And before starting with the analysis, I also want to tell one thing. People and students who have actually watched our last year's analysis video, in that we have clearly mentioned that people should have went for both the attempts. Why? Because apparently last year what happened, I was there in slot 2. I actually got a chance to appear for slot 2. This year I couldn't apply. Okay, but in slot 2 the question paper was quite difficult than slot 1, so many people who only applied for slot 2 were kind of at a disadvantage. Okay, so it is always better to give multiple attempts so that the chances of our candidature increases. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now talking about the test interface, so every student I spoke to, right, they told me one thing, that sir, the test interface was identical to the IMS mocks. Not only the test interface, but also the type of questions that were getting tested in the mocks, right? They saw a lot of shade similar questions in the actual attempt. So that is one more thing that we got to know from the students. Okay, and I kind of gathered, a lot of, memory based questions from the students also. So which we will be posting it on our actual mocks also for next year. Okay, so yes, now talking about the paper pattern. So let's look at the paper pattern. What was the paper pattern? So we had 4 sections: QA, LR, VA and GK. So no surprises there. This is like a normal SET attempt. Nothing out of the blue was seen. Okay, so we had 16 questions in QA, 12 in LR, 16 in VA and 16 questions in GK. In all, we had 60 questions and the total time frame was 60 minutes. There was no sectional time, right? No, and if you see, there was like +1, no negative marking. Okay, and there was obviously no calculator provided to the students in the exam. Okay. Now let's look at each and every sections, at what all type of questions were actually tested in each and every section. Let's see. So let's start with the QA section. So in QA, if you see, roughly there were no direct questions on percentages that were reported, but yes, there were like 2 questions on profit loss, and specifically both the questions revolved around the discount percentages. Okay, there were 2 questions on simple interest, compound interest. One question was on installments and one was on your interest. Okay, and there was a table based DI question, right? Calculation intensive question it was. But if you see, if I talk about these questions, they were easy. Okay, and equation ratio, there were no direct questions on equation. There was one question on ratio, right? Time, speed, distance, time and work, averages, mixtures, allegations, right? We had like 1, 2 and 2 questions from these 3 areas. Averages, mixtures, allegations, if you see, there was one question directly straightforward question on average. There was one question on allegations that was tested, right? And one question on time, speed, distance that was tested. It was about 2 trains crossing each other. Okay, so nothing out of the blue. A student who has prepared for an exam like NPAT should not have any trouble. Okay, one of my students, he told me, sir, after taking NPAT actual attempt, this test was not at all difficult for me. So if you look at the overall difficulty also, it was not a difficult test. Okay, there were no questions on HCF, but yes, there was one question on LCM that was asked. Coordinate geometry, there was one question, okay, where you had to calculate the midpoint. Okay, PNC, we had one question, and there was one question on progressions. There was one question on series. So overall, this is the sectional breakup that we have for the 16 questions in the QA section. Personally, I feel a student who have like spent like 20 to 25 minutes on a section like this, right, should not have a trouble getting a score of 12 plus if she is genuinely prepared for, you know, entrances like NPAT. Okay. Now, if I talk about, let's say, the dominance of the arithmetic section, in fact, all the students who have approached me, right, personally, I have advised them that if you are preparing for your symbiosis, it is always better to start with your arithmetic section. So, you can clearly see over here, there are like almost majorly, I would say 70 to 75% questions were from your arithmetic. Okay, so it is a very important section in an exam like SET. Okay, which again I will talk about this thing while I give the strategy for round 2 as well. Okay, yeah. Now talking about your LR. So in LR we had a total of 12 questions. Okay. So there was one question on logical series, one very basic question on logical series. It was a very easy question. There was one easy question on coding, decoding, right? One question on blood relation, right? There were one question from clocks and calendars. Okay. There was one question on circular arrangement. I got to know this thing from a lot of students that this question was a little irritating, right? It was very difficult to comprehend. One of my students, he couldn't even understand the question, that what question it was. Okay. Now, surprisingly, there were, you know, two questions on syllogisms, because last year, if you see in my slot, there were no syllogism questions. But this year, if you see, there were two questions on syllogisms that were actually, you know, asked. Okay. And there were four questions on critical reasoning. When I'm talking about critical reasoning, statements, assumptions, statement, conclusion, course of action, right? So all these questions, if you see, there were traces of one question from each and every, you know, subsection over here. So that was the overall breakup of your logical reasoning. Now, according to me, if you see, guys, so a student who is good in LR, who is prepared nicely for your, you know, an exam like NPAT again, right, should not have a trouble attempting like 10 to 12 questions genuinely, so that the student can score at least 9 marks in this particular section. Okay, so I feel 10 to 12 genuine attempts could be like a good attempt for a section like this. Okay. Yeah. Now coming to your verbal ability section. So if you look at the breakup, like every year there was one question on your RC which was poem based. Okay, synonyms, antonyms, there were one question each from these areas. Now a little different type of a question they had asked. Instead of asking spot the error, they have tested, you know, questions like choose correct spelling and choose correct sentence. Okay, so that was a little different this year. And there were like four questions. There was one question on check correct spelling, and there were three questions on choose correct sentence, right? And there were three questions based on idioms, out of which, you know, 1 and 2 were very difficult. That is what some students are reported. But otherwise, if you look at, there were a lot of students who told me that the section was also very easy, right? It was not at all difficult. Okay. Now, fill in the blanks, if you see, there were a total of around, you know, 5 questions on fill in the blanks, but I've just written 2 over here, because if you look at the choose a correct spelling or synonyms and antonyms, these types of questions were also tested in form of your fill in the blanks, right? But these were some miscellaneous questions that they had tested, right, in form of the fill in the blanks. Okay. And there were 4 questions on grammar. One question on articles was there, 2 questions on tenses were there, phrases, verbs were asked, right, proverbs were asked. So these types of questions were tested in this particular section. Now again, I feel in a section like this, a student can easily attempt like genuinely 13 to 15 questions with a good score of 12 and more than 12. Okay. Now coming to the GK section. Now, personally, I feel that this is a decider section, right? Because normal situations, what happen? Everyone manages to score like good in the VA, LR, and the QA section. So this is a section where the actual game changes, where you can actually go past your 45 marks, overall, right? So this is a section which kind of is a very game changer. So there were like, some, not many questions were tested on current affairs, right? In fact, there was one student who actually told me there were like 50% questions on current affairs, but I got to know this thing from a lot of other students also. I spoke with a lot of mentors on the ground, right, who are there. And it was reported that there were hardly any questions on current affairs, right? Roughly some 3 to 4 questions on current affairs were there. Rest other questions revolved around static GK, like questions like questions on Olympics was tested, right? Ozone layer, okay, then tennis tournament, right? So questions like this were tested. History related questions were tested. So this was, I feel, not a very straightforward question. So a student can easily, like all the 16 questions, if you see, it is not easy to crack like all the 16 questions, but obviously a student who has a habit of reading and who has a good GK, I would say, right, can easily attempt like at least 8 questions, and a student who has like a very good GK could have attempted like 13, odd questions. And if you look at the good score, again, this is like a section where your accuracy will become, dicey, right? Okay, so in that case, I feel a score of 7 would be like a very decent score. Okay, so yeah, overall, if you see, to sum it up, VA, a student could have like attempted 13 to 15 genuine questions in a time frame of, obviously, if you look at the time spent that generally we recommend the students is what, that in VA section you will not take more than 10 minutes. Okay, in LR, obviously you again will not take more than 15 questions. Okay, in QA, 25 minutes is more than enough time, and in GK, 10 minutes time. Okay, so this is like a strategy that you can apply and you should apply, because this is not at all a difficult test, right? Sections like VA and GK, you will not take more time, right? The only time that you will take majorly will be in the LR and the QA section, which again is at bare minimum over here, because the questions that are getting tested are not so difficult. Okay, so overall, if I talk about the difficulty level, the sections, if you look at the VA, LR and the QA section, I felt that it was a easy to moderate test. GK, I would say that it was a little moderate to difficult, but overall, if you see, this was like a moderate level, moderate difficulty level set. Okay, so now let's talk about the cutoffs. So now if I'm talking about the cutoffs, so last year what we saw, that students who had got like, more than 37, more than 38 got the PI call. So this year again, I feel, this are the practical cutoffs that I personally feel for a BBA, right? The cutoff will be 38, BSc Economics 35, so on and so forth. Now coming to the major part of the discussion. So what should be the strategy for the students who are taking the round 2 attempt? So the very first thing what I would recommend you people is, go and take a mock if you have not taken the mock already. If you've not, let's say, applied for round 1, you just applied for round 2 and you've not taken any mock. So the very first thing is that you should take the IMS mock, because the trend is very similar to what is happening in the IMS mock. So it is very, very, very important for yourself to expose yourself to the environment, testing environment. So the interface is very same, and we actually we've actually gathered, last year, Dharmik sir also went to take the test in round 1, and I also went in round 2. So we actually had, memory based questions, right, which we kind of, put this year's, mocks, and from the students' response we got to know that it was very similar to the mocks that they have given, for the this year. So what I want you people to do is, go and take a IMS mocks. That's the first thing you people should do. Okay, other than that, focus on basic areas, right? As far as your arithmetic is concerned, I would just recommend, do basic arithmetic, no need to do difficult level questions. Let's say if you, even if you encounter like, a difficult question or a two, there is always an option to skip that question. Okay, so nobody is putting a gun on your head and asking you to solve each and every question. Okay, in LR I would recommend do, critical reasoning, as there were like, handful of questions on critical reasoning. In verbal ability, again, grammar related questions, words were asked, right? There was yeah, antonyms way, there was a question, synonyms way, there was a question, so focus on that thing. And as far as your GK is concerned, try to read, about Olympics, right? Because a lot of questions were actually asked on sports, right? And civilizations were asked, right? History was asked, and there was one question, what happens if, the RBI changes the repo rate, right? So questions like this were tested in your GK. So based on that, and we'll be sharing the complete analysis also, right, on our official website. So just go through that. Okay, so that's it guys for today's, SAT analysis session. I wish you all the best, right, and I hope that you make it to symbiosis. Okay, thank you so much guys.